Virgilian part of his education might have been neglected, I interpreted so far as to say that perhaps at that moment the flames were catching hold of our worthy brother and next-door neighbour Ucalegon. The coachman said nothing, but by his faint sceptical smile he seemed to be thinking that he knew better, for that in fact Ucalegon, as it happened, was not in the way-bill. No dignity is perfect which does not at some point ally itself with the indeterminate and mysterious. The connection of the mail with the state and the executive government, a connection obvious but not yet strictly defined, gave to the whole mail establishment a grandeur and an official authority which did us service on the roads, and invested us with seasonable terrors. But perhaps these terrors were not the less impressive because their exact legal limits were imperfectly ascertained. Look at those turnpike gates. With what deferential hurry, with what an obedient start, they fly open at our approach. Look at that long line of carts and carters ahead, audaciously usurping the very crest of the road. Ah, traitors, they do not hear us as yet. But as soon as the dreadful blast of our horn reaches them with the proclamation of our approach, see with what frenzy of trepidation they fly to their horses' heads, and deprecate our wrath by the precipitation of their crane-neck quarterings. Treason they feel to be their crime. Each individual carter feels himself under the ban of confiscation and attainder. His blood is attainted through 6 generations, and nothing is wanting but the headsman and his axe, the block, and the sawdust, to close up the vista of his horrors. What? Shall it be within benefit of clergy to delay the king's message on the high road? To interrupt the great respirations, ebb or flood of the national intercourse? To endanger the safety of tidings running day and night between all nations and languages? Or can it be fancied, amongst the weakest of men, that the bodies of the criminals will be given up to their widows for Christian burial? Now the doubts which were raised as to our powers did more to wrap them in terror, by wrapping them in uncertainty, than could have been effected by the sharpest definitions of the law from the quarter sessions. We on our parts, we the collective mail, I mean, did our utmost to exalt the idea of our privileges by the insolence with which we wielded them. Whether this insolence rested upon law that gave it a sanction, or upon conscious power haughtily dispensing with that sanction, equally it spoke from a potential station, and the agent in each particular insolence of the moment was viewed reverentially, as one having authority. Sometimes, after breakfast, His Majesty's mail would become frisky, and in its difficult wheelings amongst the intricacies of early markets, it would upset an apple cart, a cart loaded with eggs, etc. Huge was the affliction and dismay, awful was the smash, though, after all, I believe the damage might be levied upon the 100. I, as far as possible, endeavoured in such a case to represent the conscience and moral sensibilities of the mail. And when wildernesses of eggs were lying poached under our horses' hoofs, then would I stretch forth my hands in sorrow, saying, in words too celebrated in those days from the false echoes of Marengo, "Ah, wherefore have we not time to weep over you?" Which was quite impossible, for in fact we had not even time to laugh over them. Footnote regarding false echoes. Yes, false. For the words ascribed to Napoleon, as breathed to the memory of Desailles, were never uttered at all. They stand in the same category of theatrical inventions as the cry of the foundering Vanneur, as the vaunt of General Cambron at Waterloo, La garde meurt, mais ne se rend pas, as the repartees of Talleyrand. End of footnote. Tied to post office time, with an allowance in some cases of 50 minutes for 11 miles, could the Royal Mail pretend to undertake the offices of sympathy and condolence? Could it be expected to provide tears for the accidents of the road? If even it seemed to trample on humanity, it did so, I contended, in discharge of its own more peremptory duties. Upholding the morality of the mail a fortiori, I upheld its rights, I stretched to the uttermost its privilege of imperial precedency, and astonished weak minds by the feudal powers which I hinted to be lurking constructively in the charters of this proud establishment. Once I remember being on the box of the Holyhead Mail, between Shrewsbury and Oswestry, when a tawdry thing from Birmingham, some tally-ho or high flyer, all flaunting with green and gold, came up alongside of us. What a contrast to our royal simplicity of form and colour is this plebeian wretch! The single ornament on our dark ground of chocolate colour was the mighty shield of the imperial arms, but emblazoned in proportions as modest as a signet ring bears to a seal of office. Even this was displayed only on a single panel, whispering rather than proclaiming our relations to the state, whilst the beast from Birmingham had as much writing and painting on its sprawling flanks as would have puzzled a decipherer from the tombs of Luxor. For some time this Birmingham machine ran along by our side, a piece of familiarity that seemed to us sufficiently Jacobinical. But all at once a movement of the horses announced a desperate intention of leaving us behind. "Do you see that?" I said to the coachman. "I see," was his short answer. He was awake, yet he waited longer than seemed prudent, for the horses of our audacious opponent had a disagreeable air of freshness and power. But his motive was loyal. His wish was that the Birmingham conceit should be full blown before he froze it. When that seemed ripe, he unloosed, or, to speak by a stronger image, he sprang his known resources. He slipped our royal horses like cheetahs or hunting leopards after the affrighted game. How they could retain such a reserve of fiery power after the work they had accomplished seemed hard to explain. But on our side, besides the physical superiority, was a tower of strength, namely, the King's name, which they upon the adverse faction wanted. Passing them without an effort, as it seemed, we threw them into the rear with so lengthening an interval between us as proved in itself the bitterest mockery of their presumption, whilst our guard blew back a shattering blast of triumph that was really too painfully full of derision. I mention this little incident for its connection with what followed. A Welshman, sitting behind me, asked if I had not felt my heart burn within me during the continuance of the race. I said no, because we were not racing with a mail, so that no glory could be gained. In fact, it was sufficiently mortifying that such a Birmingham thing should dare to challenge us. The Welshman replied that he didn't see that, for that a cat might look at a king, and a Birmingham coach might lawfully race the Holyhead Mail. "Race us, perhaps," I replied, "though even that has an air of sedition, but not beat us. This would have been treason, and for its own sake I am glad that the tally-ho was disappointed." So dissatisfied did the Welshman seem with this opinion, that at last I was obliged to tell him a very fine story from one of our elder dramatists, viz., that once in some oriental region, when the prince of all the land with his splendid court were flying their falcons, a hawk suddenly flew at a majestic eagle, and in defiance of the eagle's prodigious advantages, in sight also of all the astonished field sportsmen, spectators, and followers, killed him on the spot. The prince was struck with amazement at the unequal contest, and with burning admiration for its unparalleled result. He commanded that the hawk should be brought before him, caressed the bird with enthusiasm, and ordered that, for the commemoration of his matchless courage, a crown of gold should be solemnly placed on the hawk's head; but then that immediately after this coronation the bird should be led off to execution, as the most valiant indeed of traitors, but not the less a traitor that had dared to rise in rebellion against his liege lord the eagle. "Now," said I to the Welshman, "how painful it would have been to you and me as men of refined feelings, that this poor brute, the tally-ho, in the impossible case of a victory over us, should have been crowned with jewellery gold with Birmingham ware, or paste diamonds, and then led off to instant execution." The Welshman doubted if that could be warranted by law. And when I hinted at the 10th of Edward III, chapter 15, for regulating the precedency of coaches, as being probably the statute relied on for the capital punishment of such offences, he replied dryly, that if the attempt to pass a mail was really treasonable, it was a pity that the tally-ho appeared to have so imperfect an acquaintance with law. These were among the gaieties of my earliest and boyish acquaintance with males. But alike the gayest and most terrific of my experiences rose again